A few months ago, I went to Gotham Comedy Club with my sister. The lineup was, as to be expected, of varying quality. But there was one guy in particular who was having a very bad night. In the audience's defense, he really wasn't that funny. His joke framing device was weird, and the punchlines themselves contradictory. A drunk woman in the back demanded some clarification. It got personal. The energy got real weird. And when his time was up, he just sort of shrugged, and handed the mic back to the host. I thought about this during James Acaster's late night performance of his new show, Cold Lasagna Hate Myself 1999, at Littlefield in Brooklyn last week. Like Daniel Sloss, whose show X I have reviewed here some number of weeks back, Acaster is a comedian from the UK, though English rather than Scottish, who I first saw thanks to the simultaneous release of multiple specials on Netflix. And, like Daniel Sloss, it was specifically a recommendation by Philip DeFranco that pushed me to check them out. The shows, collectively titled Repertoire, are very funny, and I highly recommend checking them out. I hope that this special I just saw also ends up on Netflix, but not, as with X, because I think everyone else needs to see the show. It's more selfish than that. I want to see it, because what I saw at Littlefield was not actually Cold Lasagna Hate Myself 1999. I'm not really sure what it was. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week I Review. My name is Mid-Tier Comedy Fan, and today I'm talking about that show. It was Acaster's second performance of the night. The first one ended less than 30 minutes before the doors of the second opened, and though the show didn't start until 10:30, he came out on stage at 10 anyway. He sat there on a stool in an iridescent jacket and sunglasses, holding his phone and a black iPod Classic, changing the music wildly and frequently. A gift and a head of cabbage were placed on the stage. He opened the gift. It looked like Robitussin or something. He removed the head of cabbage. My companion, who's an Acaster superfan, told me later that was a thing. Acaster played the first half of the song Euroleague by Paul Williams 5 times over that half hour. On each, the lights would change and he would look out into the crowd and we'd wonder if it was starting early, but no, he'd go back to the stool and check his phone some more. He replied to a tweet my superfan friend tagged him in. As the starting time drew closer, though, the gaps between these plays shrank. Eventually, he was literally cutting the song off midway to start it again. Euroleague, at least in the first half, because I didn't bother listening to the second, is about having a not-so-great 2017, but pushing past it, getting back on the grind in 2018. In 2019, it seems a little dated, but it wouldn't have felt so when Acaster started doing this a year ago. Eventually, we would learn the thematic connection to the song, that the 1999 in the show's name really was just nonsense, and that it's actually about 2017. He was going to tell us the story of his dirty, rotten, no good, very bad year. A year where he lost a girlfriend, an agent. And I think there was a third thing, but I don't know because we never heard the story. We never really heard any of the stories. The first extended bit of the show, a 20-minute or so run about a breakup he had in 2013, ended with something interesting. He addressed us directly, asking us, please to not tweet about what we had just heard. I've actually heard this before from comedians, and it's pretty much always for the same reason, because people tend to miss the point. Most of us just aren't funny. He specifically mentioned Twitter, but I imagine he'd find it problematic if I relate it here, so I won't, because I wouldn't be able to do justice to his threading of the needle. Suffice it to say, it's a great story. I hope you find out about it. I don't know if that line about Twitter was an official part of the show or a diss at Brooklyn or maybe American audiences more generally, but it set a new tone with this particular audience, one that ultimately overtook the entire set. Littlefield is a small venue, but it was crowded, being a sold-out show and all that. I was right up at the front of the standing room only crowd, probably 30 feet from the stage. About 15 feet to my left were a trio of girls who couldn't have been older than 22 and maybe were younger, but with like good fakes. In any case, they were drunk. And they were talking. Not heckling or anything like that woman at Gotham had been, just talking to each other. Like no one else was even there and there wasn't a show going on right in front of them. This happened for a while before anyone actually said anything, and it was ultimately James Acaster himself who did so. As he geared up to reenact a mental breakdown that he had had on a telephone call in 2017, he paused and asked them to stop. The worst offender attempted to explain herself. "I was putting on lipstick," she said. And of course, there was disbelief. "Seems to me that that's one of those activities—" I will not apologize for this terrible impression. "that is made significantly harder by talking." She said something else. He told her that he hated her. Then it got weird. Because I was in full agreement, but apparently the crowd wasn't, or that was the impression he had gotten, because he immediately started to justify himself. He talked about the differences between American and British audiences and the fact that he likes being in a job where he can tell garbage people that he hates them. And couldn't we all be so lucky? Yes. And he was confused about why people were on her side when she was still talking during this whole rant. And suddenly we're 15 minutes past the point where he was supposed to have started that phone call. He tried to get back into the headspace. As someone who isn't great at staying on topic and often doesn't remember how I get to where I end up in conversations, I was genuinely impressed at his ability to spend all of this time off topic with the audience and then go back exactly where he left off. But then a bottle fell at the bar and the moment was lost. He gave up entirely and decided to just skip the bit. "We'll go back to it at the end," he promised. We didn't. I assume that what followed, a bit about his hometown of Kettering, was part of the show that we had had tickets to see. But then, with half an hour left to go, he said that he was so glad that the show was almost over before realizing there was a full third of the performance left. He then apologized for not sounding more excited that he had to be up there another 30 minutes. I found this hilarious. But then, instead of going back to the bit that he had cut off mid-thought, I paused for a few moments and said, "I know what I'll do. I'm going to talk about Bake Off." Or, as Netflix has decided to call it stateside, The Great British Baking Show. This was new stuff. James Acaster's appearance on The Great Celebrity Bake Off aired just a few weeks ago, so an extended sequence about his experiences behind the scenes couldn't have been part of the show that he has been performing for the past year. So what it actually felt like was something he was working out for his next special. And it was very funny. Sad, too, tonally fitting right in with the rest of the set. But as someone who's a big fan of Bake Off, there was some really interesting insight into it alongside all of the humor and pathos. Still, it wasn't totally ironed out. Literally the last thing he said, the last Joe of the entire show, was immediately recanted as an uncalled for ad-lib. It was a bit of Paul Hollywood body shaming. At the very beginning of the performance, he had made a bunch of remarks about quote-unquote edgy comedians, folks like Ricky Gervais who have given up on trying to be clever, instead doubling down on lazily insulting marginalized groups. He did so while saying that he was not going to be one of them. But between the audience insults and the body shaming, he admitted he kind of was, which is funny. I hadn't watched the Bake Off episode yet, and doing so after this was fascinating because the context that Acaster gave for his genuinely bizarre appearance that you should totally check out really adds to the whole thing. My favorite fact is that he was stirring that creme pat for 45 minutes. But perhaps just as interesting were the inconsistencies between his stories and the show itself. The specific details he added to certain moments that were just straight up wrong. He said that he was asked for 6 identical cream horns during the technical, but he wasn't. He was asked for identical flapjacks in the signature. He described a bit of business that the hosts did when they called for 30 minutes, but that bit actually came at the halfway point. These little details don't matter, but they serve as a fascinating example of 2 things. One, how memory is unreliable. Every time a story is retold, it goes back into memory anew. So over time, as something is repeated, the details can shift. There's part of why eyewitness accounts are really rather unreliable in court proceedings. This sort of fits with the bit about the hosts and marshmallow gun, since the timing of that is irrelevant to the joke itself. And 2, how little tweaks make a story more compelling. Here's a fun fact. I intentionally fudged one part of the pre-show timeline that I discussed at the beginning of this video. While it's true that James Acaster did respond to a photo my friend tagged him in on Twitter before the show began, he actually did it while we were waiting outside for the doors to open. He was on his phone while he sat up on the stage, but he wasn't doing the thing I said he did. But the story flows better the way that I told it, just as the identical thing does the way Acaster did. When he finally left the stage, he restarted Paul Williams' EuroLeague. After a rough 2017, he'd be back on his grind the following year. Its irrelevance to the performance that we had just seen felt like its own kind of joke, a coda to the show that we were supposed to see but never did. James Acaster told us that though it may have seemed like a uniquely memorable performance, he was going to have forgotten it by Friday. I don't doubt him. By the time this video goes up, he will have performed at least a dozen more times. Those shows probably went better. Don't know how many audiences he compared to The Tethered. Or maybe they were worse. Regardless, they'll all just blur together. But you know who will never forget this performance? That girl. What? The drunk one who was talking. No, she was probably gone before the show even started. Then who? Me. Of course I was going to say me. I was going to say it, smile smugly into the camera, and then say my score like I always do. Sorry. No, you're not. That's true. Forget it. Already have. I hate you. 8.0. Don't you... Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, that is great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I've done 3 comedy specials now, so this is like a thing. Anyways, I hope to see you next week.